Let me start off by talking a little bit about what I'm seeing out there in terms of excitement for Republicans. We were involved in the Republican campaign for governor in Virginia. And we saw something in the data, and we were doing it for the RGA. Chris Wilson was doing polling for the campaign, and we worked together through the campaign. But one of the things we saw was the intensity level of Republicans being extremely high. Virtually every survey we did, there was a 5, 6, 7-point advantage. Sometimes it got up to a 10-point advantage in terms of definite vote versus the overall ballot. Now, the overall ballot stayed fairly close for most of the campaign. And going into the final days, we had it at a 2-point lead, which is exactly where he ended up. But the intensity level is kind of a normal thing for the out party from the White House. One of the things an incumbent president does, he acts as gravity for his party's voters to kind of pull them back to earth. It goes back to a tendency of American voters that they're able to scream with alarm much better than they scream with pride. And that certainly is what we're seeing in the data right now. The interesting thing is that in terms of polling, everyone was very reluctant about going in the field. They kept delaying and delaying and delaying. We wanted to kind of see what the environment is out there. Since Virginia's election, everyone wants to go in the field. Everyone wants to see where their data is. And rightfully so. Their data is looking very, very good for the campaign, or for the Republican campaigns. If I had to call it today, I think we will win back control of the House of Representatives. And I think we have a better than even chance of actually picking up the Senate again, which not many people are talking about today. But we have some very good candidates coming forward, like a Tiffany Smiley in Washington State, that is kind of unexpected to develop very quickly. But the bottom line is, and there's kind of two key points that I would make. One is that the Biden honeymoon is over. Certainly his numbers have come back to earth, and we're seeing that reflected all through the data. And the second is, the country is ready for Republicans to come forward, not to tell them what we're against, but to tell them what we're for. And we're in an environment where many of those issues are issues that will play to our benefit. In fact, if you ask direction of the country today, it is 32% right track, 60% wrong track, and 52% saying that the country is off on the wrong track strongly. So there's some real intensity there. What is good about these numbers for us is those numbers are not only with Republicans, who are overwhelmingly negative about the direction of the country, but very strong amongst those voters who are in the middle. And let me explain about the middle a little bit. It's something that we have done in recent surveys for Ripon Society. We always ask the conservative, moderate, liberal question differently. We have in 30 years. We ask, are you conservative or are you liberal? And we allow people to volunteer whether they are moderate. In 30 years of asking that question, we have never had the country more than 10% say that they are moderate volunteer. The other 90% are willing to say, I'm either conservative or liberal. But then we ask, are you very conservative or very liberal? And that gives you the real ideologues, the people that are on the extreme in terms of their ideology. They think through everything in terms of their ideology. And I think that has some impact, because with a 20% turnout in Republican and Democrat primaries, they represent the overwhelming number of Republicans and Democrats who vote, who pull then our candidates off to the far left or the far right as we go through those primaries. In this particular survey, and it was very close to the Battleground survey about a month earlier that we did the same thing, once we separated out the very conservative and separated out the very liberal and took the volunteered moderate, the somewhat conservative and somewhat liberals, they represent 72% of the electorate. and they basically run, in the years we've been doing this, they run between 66% and 72%. And I think that's unfortunate sometimes that we get pulled off into a corner when in fact that not every solution, which we see from many of our members, not every solution has to do anything to do with ideology. It has to do with what's the best solution that you can offer for those problems that affect voters every day. The other thing we saw in the survey is that when we asked most important issues, when you look at extremely important, very important, we had 5 or 6 issues that rated 80% or more in terms of concern with voters, as opposed to having them choose first most important, second most important. What we find is the issue agenda with voters out there is very diverse in terms of what they're looking at. And that's another point that I want to come back and make and show a little bit later today. On Joe Biden's performance as president, when he first came into office, he was in the mid-50s in terms of favorable or approve of the job he was doing. That changed very, very quickly. In fact, Afghanistan acted as a catalyst in terms of what was happening there, in terms of moving them more negative. Today, 46% approve and 49% disapprove. He's upside down by 3 points. But more importantly, strongly approve is 30%. Strongly disapprove is 44%, 14 points higher. And that intensity is coming not only because of Republicans, but coming because of those centrist voters in the middle, or independent voters, if you will. We actually asked a variety of different questions on how Biden was doing in terms of handling those issues. The only issue where he had a net positive was on handling and dealing with COVID. And that's a carryover from so many voters deciding it was a key issue in terms of voting against Trump in the fall election. And that's the one area where he's been able to hold up. But the most important thing is when you look at immigration, the economy, cost of living, inflation, even jobs, all those issues, he's either dead even with jobs, or all the rest of the issues, he is upside down by anywhere from 10 to 17 points. And that is one of the things I'm trying to remind the Republicans out there. So we don't have to bash them hard. All we have to do is keep the discussion on economic issues, that we have an advantage on every one of those issues as we go through the campaign. And in fact, we have Republicans versus Democrats who will do a better job on the issues. We have a 6-point advantage on immigration. We have a 6-point advantage on the economy. We have a 6-point advantage on cost of living. We have a 4-point advantage on jobs, which is usually a more Democratic issue. And we have a 7-point advantage on inflation and only an 8-point deficit on education, which is something that usually we have somewhere around a 20 to 25-point deficit on. So not only is Biden in trouble on those issues, when you get into, and what they always love to say when the president's job approval is upside down, we'll look at job approval of Congress. That doesn't matter as much as who do they believe will do a better job on those issues that affect them every day. 2 big things that we asked in the survey, and we've been seeing this trend for a little while. One is we asked a 2-way question. Do you prefer a politician who consistently fights for my values, even if it means not finding a solution to very often? Or a politician who is willing to work together to get things done, even if it means compromising on my values sometimes? By a 64 to 28 margin, they're saying we want compromise and we want solutions. So again, one of the key messages I think we need for all our Republicans out there is be for something, not be against something. And we have moved a huge section of the electorate that's tired of all the negatives. They're ready for solutions and they're ready for Congress to do something. And we need to keep that focus very, very strong. The other is a very telling question. Do you believe the federal government meets your needs and the needs of your family? By 43 to 53, voters say no. And on strongly agree to strongly disagree, it was 21 to 39. A 2-to-1 margin strongly believes that Congress and Washington is not giving solutions to what they need, what they want, and what they face every day. So I want to kind of end it there, slow up there, so I can take a lot of questions. One of the things that we did was ask a lot of issue questions here in terms of policies on things we could do. And we were very happy with what we got in terms of results, particularly in the areas of the economy and anything that dealt on the economy. I think we can, without being overstated on what we want to do, we can take those strengths we inherently have as a party and take those strengths we have with the current environment and move us forward in terms of being seen in a much different way than we've been seen in the last 3 or 4 years under Trump. And I think that is extremely important for the party. It certainly is going to be important on winning control of the Congress and having an opportunity of winning control back of the Senate. And I think we get that as long as we're approaching it, not on what we're against, but what we're for. We have an opportunity to really redefine our party in a way that normally the out party does not get a chance to do until they have a nominee for their party running in the next election. So let me kind of end it there, Jim.
Okay.
And let's see what questions I can take and see where we can go with that.
All right. Very good. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you so much for doing this. I love your polling stuff. It's always the stuff I'm really thinking about and it's helpful, especially as I don't work on the Hill anymore. I would love to get your thoughts on being for something, not to contradict Leader McConnell, but he said, or it was reported last week, is that's not what we're worried about, right? Can you comment on a strategy, dare I say, of positivity, and if that's effective, and in what areas?
Well, again, I go back to those economic areas. I think what we have to be careful of is having some of the things that have driven our positioning in recent years, social media, what's happening on cable news, and let them define who we are rather than we define who we are. I think that is a key thing because they are looking for that dissension and that mix-up to get clients or to get eyeballs watching them. They are not necessarily interested in our role in actually making a difference in people's lives. And I think that's where we're kind of in conflict to them. In terms of, and let me give you an example, best example I can use from being pulled too far to the right, is after Virginia, a lot of the conservative, very strong conservative groups, and certainly Fox News, and you saw it on social media, all they wanted to talk about was critical race theory and how that was so important and we needed to be out there doing that issue. They totally missed what happened in the Virginia race. It wasn't about critical race theory. It was about whether or not parents have a right to have a say in what their kids are being taught. And it is a great example of don't let those that are on the far right who are ginning up issues like that because that's where they fundraise, that's where they get more eyeballs watching the news, that's where they get more eyeballs looking at the social media. That was not the issue. And in fact, it was something that we were handed, kind of an unforced error on the part of the Democratic campaign that we were able to exploit. And one of the reasons why I think we did so well in that race is we had a candidate that didn't come across as Trump-like. He came across as, yes, conservative, but he wasn't crazy conservative. And that undid, or I think put a lot of the Democrats off balance because, for example, the Democrat campaign ran, if you look at individual spots, ran 9,500 spots trying to connect Youngkin to Trump through the campaign. 9,500 spots in each market. 9 different spots that they put on the air that they just drove home, and it just rolled off. It not only rolled off him because he wasn't Trump-like in the way he came across, it actually did nothing to increase the intensity on the Democrat side, which was the other thing I think they were hoping would happen. In fact, the only time we saw the Democrat intensity increase during the campaign was about a 2-week period, 10-day period, where they started going after the Texas abortion back and forth that was going on. And they played to that, and we saw not the Republican intensity come down, we saw the Democrat intensity come up. But as soon as they pulled that off the air, the intensity came back down for the Democrats. So a lot, and it's very important to keep in mind in off-year elections, intensity of the vote almost has as much importance as the difference in the ballot. Because when we were looking at being 2 points down on the ballot, but a 7-point advantage in terms of definite vote, we knew we had the advantage in terms of the election. And it allowed us to keep focused on what our message was versus their message. Is that
great? Amy, thank you. Rusty, right here, and then let's go over here.
So Ed, I was looking at your results, and it was interesting dealing with COVID. That was probably the biggest area where there was difference. And I was just curious what your thoughts are around how to change that, or if it really matters, because when we get into 2022, maybe this will be far enough away from us that that issue won't matter anymore. But anyway, just wanted to get a breakdown of what causes that, why the Republicans aren't doing better.
Well, I mean, the problem is that on that issue, it has been so politicized. Celinda Lake, who I do the background poll with, she and I have been working the last year on a book that is going to come out in the spring called A Question of Respect, and it's a focus on incivility in our politics today and the various measurements that are there and how to get around it. And we got towards kind of outlining the whole book and got to the 9th of the 10 chapters that we're putting in and realized we had to address the issue of COVID and the pandemic because it is something that was not driven by science in so many sectors of the electorate. It was driven by the kind of politicizing into two sides. I mean, it's still interesting today. You watch the Senate, and all the Republican senators have no mask, and all the Democrat senators all wear masks. It's become a political statement. And I think that has carried down to the voters. The only reason why we're at a deficit on that is that's a split of the voters that we lose out on, because it's the one area where the independent voters tend to lean more towards where the Democrat position is, or the perceived Democrat position is. And I think we've tried to do a lot to offset that, but it is so baked in that it's hard to deal with. And one of the concerns as I talk to medical doctors, that we had a scare in the last 2 weeks that had a tremendous impact on the stock market about the COVID variant that came out in South America. As long as this continues to persist, the biggest danger we have is eventually there's a variant that the vaccine doesn't work on. And I think that is especially scary because people are so polarized on that issue that getting us back to doing what we need to do if we have that, I think it's going to be very hard for the country to move there again. And I think very bad for the country. But again, the more we can try to not politicize it on how we talk about it, the better off we would be. And it doesn't help, quite frankly, when we have Republicans, and we saw in Fox and Friends, when the first news came out about the new variant in South Africa, they immediately went out there and said, oh, this is just being made up by the Democrats in order to pull the intensity of their voters up and the intensity of our voters down. It's a very, very scary situation. I think more importantly, the way to backdoor on the COVID is all the concerns. I mean, I'm sure we've all dealt with the excuses, not as excuses, it can have meaning, of things coming to us slower because of supplies being cut back, or the problems we're having with trade and the impact it's having on our economy. We have to make sure, again, that we approach that from a standpoint of what is our position in terms of these economic issues, and not make it a COVID issue as we talk about those issues as a strength.
Okay, good. Peter, go ahead, and then over here to Fred.
Ed, looking at the polls, one of the things that caught my attention was the fact that you have 72%, which is not surprising, of people who were relatively anchored in moderate political philosophy. And one of the basic premises you keep hearing, at least on an anecdotal basis, and I feel this, is unhappiness with both political parties. And I'm not talking about unhappiness between the political parties. The Republicans are deeply unhappy what's happening in the Republican Party, and Democrats are deeply unhappy what's happening in the Democratic Party. And could you comment on that, and whether or not, do you think will ever exist a period of time where if these issues are left unattended, that might create the possibility of another movement occurring that will bring these unaligned voters possibly rising together?
I honestly do. Look, I've been doing this for a long time, and 22 is probably going to be my last election in terms of out there. And I've worked in politics since I was 12, so I've been doing this a long, long time, since 1964. And one of the things that has developed out there, which is why we start looking at the centrist label, I think part of it is to not label these people as moderates, to label these people as centrist, is extremely important. Because the term moderate has been, for years, been used by both the far right and the far left to kind of demonize people of, you don't have any political opinion. These people have plenty of political opinion. They care about their families, they care about their country, and they, quite frankly, are getting increasingly upset with both sides on terms of the extremes of both sides. The thing that's unfortunate is that they do represent the majority of the country. They don't wear their ideology on their sleeve. I've always kind of laughed when people call other Republicans rhinos, because quite frankly, usually the person using that term is the real rhino. They don't understand all the policies and all the philosophies of the party. But I also think we have to be very careful, and if there's one thing I can do before I step out of this arena, is get people to start looking at it in terms of centrist as opposed to moderate, so that they are seen as people that have an opinion. There's always been discussions about a third party developing. The reason why a third party has never developed is because a third party always kind of comes from the far right or the far left. And so they're not appealing to the overall base. Something I tease Celinda with and have throughout on this book, and I've been saying it to her for the last 2 years, because she is a progressive, is that progressives are the Tea Party of the left. And that's all we've seen over the last year. They are creating more problems for their party, more problems for their president than we are at this point. And I think that's something that we also need to keep an eye on, that rather than us doing that dirty work, let them fight. Let them keep the president's numbers down. I talked to some Democrats very early on, and when you think about this strategy appeared to be where Biden is going. First of all, I think Biden is a centrist. He is not a socialist. He is not far left. He is a centrist. And he understood the problems with the progressives for two reasons. One is, I think he probably sees him, much like I said, as the Tea Party of the left. But the other is he had a Speaker of the House that was primarily Speaker of the House because the progressives at the last minute unified behind her and put her into Speaker. And so she's having to play a different game. And what these Democrats told me is he had a very conscious focus for the first 6 months, which was have a very early vote that was 100% the Democrats, and be able to tell the progressives, oh, you got this. Then come in with a infrastructure bill that was high dollars that he negotiated down. And then in doing so, got Republican votes on both sides so that he could play more his centrist position. And he was on track to do that. He was on track to do that when he got the Senate vote with 19 senators, Republican senators, voting with him in that infrastructure vote. But three things happened. One is 2 days after he got that vote in the Senate, Afghanistan fell. And he also had the problems at the border in terms of what was happening on the border. And you began to see numbers on inflation popping up. And he may have had a very good strategy, but he left one major piece out as I saw it. He didn't tell his people that had focus in those areas, I want no surprises. If there's a problem developing there, let me know so I can address it. But instead, he looked like he was not able to juggle more than one ball at a time. And one of the biggest things you hear said about him today is he's incompetent. He's incapable. Not the Republican far right that he has Alzheimer's and doesn't remember his own name to hear them talk. I think he's actually in a much better position than that. But he didn't cover all his bases. He didn't let his people know no surprises, which should always be the first thing the president says to their administration.
Ed, right over here, and then over to our last question with Don Carlson.
Thanks very much, Ed. One question I have is, how do you control in asking these questions for the economic status of the respondents? Do you control for that? Because you can see how some of the answers would potentially differ quite a bit based on where somebody is economically.
We don't. In fact, the biggest problem we have learned over the years is that we have to be somewhat aware on different issues that we ask about, that there's a gender difference. Men call it inflation, women call it cost of living. Men, if they seem to be more aware of statistics in terms of inflation, women are shopping every day and doing, their whether it's grocery shopping or the one thing we see is gasoline prices. Women respond to gasoline prices far sooner than most men do because they're looking at that specific number as they fill up their gas tanks. So that's the bigger thing we watch for. The one thing we do watch for that has some impact is education level, and kind of look at it from that standpoint, because we can't really trust the economic response that they give us. We do ask, are you upper income, lower income, middle income? We always get 7 or 8% saying they're upper income. Well, by the definition, economic definition of upper income, it's only 2 or 3%. It's not 6 or 7%. So we've just kind of learned over years what to watch. The one thing I will say, this is really the first time in a long time I've seen everyone across the board respond to all the economic issues. For example, we've always known that the economy, we're stronger on. When you ask about jobs specifically, the Democrats are stronger on. But when you look at this data, jobs not as much as the economy, but jobs is up to a net plus for us. And it shouldn't be missed that a lot of the proposals that Biden is pushing right now, he has worked in a very strong jobs message to it, because I'm sure they're saying the same thing, that they are not faring as well as they normally do on the jobs issue.